Okay. Good morning, all. It's my privilege to welcome you all to the inaugural session of the two-day international webinar on women and development organized by the Department of Economics, University of Kerala. First of all, I would like to welcome the President of the inaugural session, Dr. Anitha V, Professor and Head of the Department of Economics, University of Kerala. She has always been a strong source of support for all the programs in the department. She will be delivering the presidential address in the session. With much love and respect, I welcome you, ma'am, to the session. Now I extend hearty welcome to Professor Dr. V.P. Mahadevan Pillai, sir, the Honorable Vice Chancellor of University of Kerala. He is a world-renowned academician and a noted scholar in optoelectronics and material science. Has always been keen on the quality and progress of the university and has been encourageous and inspirational. It's our pleasure to have you here, sir, to inaugurate this international webinar. On behalf of the Department of Economics and all of us present here, I warmly welcome you, sir. Next, I welcome the Organizing Secretary of this webinar, Mr. Siddik R, Assistant Professor, Department of Economics, University of Kerala, Director, Inter-University Center for Alternative Economics. He will be presenting the theme of the webinar, the heart and soul of this webinar. With much love and respect, I welcome you, sir. Now I welcome Dr. S. Naseeb, Member Syndicate, University of Kerala, Convener, Standing Committee of the Syndicate on Academics and Research, who has joined us to deliver the felicitation. I welcome you, sir, to this inaugural session. Now I welcome Professor Dr. Gobchandran KG, Member Syndicate, University of Kerala, has also joined us to deliver the felicitation address. He is currently a professor in optoelectronics in University of Kerala and a great scholar in material science. On behalf of the Department of Economics, I welcome you, sir. Now I welcome Dr. Meera Velayudhan, Advisor, Gender Park and President and Policy Analyst of Indian Association for Women's Studies, who has joined us to deliver the keynote address. She has been involved in gender studies from a very long time and has focused on gender, caste, social reforms, nationalism, and popular movements in Kerala. She will be talking to us on women's rights to land. It's our privilege to have you here with us, ma'am. On behalf of the Department of Economics, University of Kerala, we welcome you, ma'am, to this webinar.
Thank you.
I also welcome Mr. Manu Pratap, student of first PG Economics, who will be delivering vote of thanks for the session. Welcome, Manu. Now I extend hearty welcome to all the faculty members of the Department of Economics, University of Kerala, Professor Abdul Salim sir, Professor A.K. Prasad sir, Professor Manju S. Nair, Professor Shija S.R. and Dr. Christabel P.J. Welcome all. I also welcome all the resource persons, paper presenters, and all participants who have joined us in this webinar. Once again, on behalf of the Department of Economics, I welcome you all to this two-day international webinar. Thank you. Now, I invite Dr. Anitha V for the further proceedings of the session. Thank you.
Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor V.P. Mahadevan Pillai, respected syndicate members, Dr. S. Naseeb, Professor Gobchandran, the keynote speaker of this session, Dr. Meera Velayudhan, Advisor Gender Park and President Indian Association of Women's Studies, Mr. Siddik R, Organizing Secretary of this conference, Manu Pratap, Revathy, my dear colleagues, distinguished delegates, and dear students. A very warm good morning to one and all. I am very proud to chair an international conference on women and development organized by my male colleague, Mr. Siddik R. Even though the topic has been discussed during the last few decades in different areas, still the real situation of women is not improved much. According to World Economic Forum's Global Gender Gap Index 2019-20, India was ranked 112th, having addressed only 66.8% of the gap. The major components of the indexes are economic participation and opportunity, educational attainment, health and survival, and political empowerment. We can see that on an average, only 55% of adult women are in the labor market, whereas it is 78% in the case of men. The report shows that about 40% of the wage gap, that is the ratio of the wage of a woman to that of a man in a similar position, and over 50% of the income gap, that is the ratio of the total wage and non-wage income of women to that of a men, are still to be bridged. In India, recently the Supreme Court has mentioned huge gender disparity in the household care works, and the question arises is whether we have to implement a salary for the households care works. As per the World Economic Forum's report, an Indian woman spend an average of 352 minutes, that is more than 5 hours per day for household care works, whereas it is only 97 minutes, that is around 1 hour for the men. In Kerala, government had given due importance to this matter, and several policies and programs have been undertaken, and even in the last budget we have seen allocation for care economy. Even though Kerala's position in the gender equality index is high compared to other states, maybe due to education and political empowerment, its women's participation in formal employment and men's participation in the household care works are still very low. Without the equal inclusion of half of the world's talent, we will not be able to achieve the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals in 2030. With these words, I take this opportunity to congratulate Mr. Siddik for organizing an international conference in this relevant area. Thank you all.
I would like to welcome Siddik sir to present the theme, sir.
Thank you, Sharon. It's a very warm good morning to all. First of all, most Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor VP Mahadevan Pillai sir, and Professor Meera Velayudhan, and other Professor Anitha, the presiding person, and other dignitaries, offline and online, dear friends. It is indeed a great pleasure because 4 years back, we in fact proposed this seminar to conduct a seminar on women and development. In the university we proposed, and university readily accepted, and this is in fact the third international seminar in this line, which is pure strictly speaks on the issues of women and development. We would like to basically make the seminar in this topic because there are many issues across the world, and indeed in India the concerns of women, a part of being the center of development, is not being addressed properly ever since, and there are many attempts from the world, the United Nations Development Program ever since 1970s, though India had actually given a lot of priority to women, especially there are a lot of scholars we had who is in fact par with the men of their time. However, these days, especially women, unless you are not recognizing the importance and the work of women, who in fact had half the sky, or rightfully own half the sky and half the earth, as Clara Zetkin said. If unless and until you recognize the importance of women in the process of development, the development of our country may not be actually fulfilled. In that sense, the work and welfare of the women is definitely the part and parcel, and their role in the discourse of development is essentially cannot be dismissed. In that context only, we in fact like to bring the whole discussion of women as the center of development discourse. So it is not in fact the moment we say that we all, the academic community should recognize this very important role of women, who in fact perform, who in fact double pay in the whole business of raising the economy, raising the family for everything. If a woman is working, she's also working back home, as well as she is also working in the in the workplace. So in that sense, one place her contribution is not recognized well, and that is why it has not been reflected in the national income accounting. That is why recently there are many scholars, Idra Hirabe and many scholars in fact talked about the calculation of women's work in the national income accounting, and that has to be there. Then only the whole country's GDP can be understood in a holistic sense. So with this, actually there are so many efforts across the world, and women as a center of development is also being brought out by the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, and therefore the importance and the discussion of this particular seminar makes its own point. And every year we do have actually different themes. This year what we are in fact focused more on is the women workplace and their contribution. So women and work is in fact we are focusing on, especially in the entrepreneurial sector and other aspect of life. So with this point, the importance of the seminar is quite evident, and we do have actually a couple of an excellent papers, and I received a couple of excellent paper. One is this is one of the first of its kinds that women on board in India, especially in the entrepreneurial sector, the role of women, especially in the top brass of the companies, is limited. But ever since 2013, there is a legislation, I think 11 or 13, there is a legislation in that it insists that the role of women should be there in the board. So this has actually been focused by the work of Nandita, and that is going to be a nice presentation in the afternoon. So we do also have the importance of women's work in the whole process of calculating women's work in their daily core with that of their laboring effort in the workplace. So that has been discussed by the gender disparity in utilization pattern of time in Kerala, which was jointly done by Anjana BS, research scholars of our department, with Professor Prasad AK. So that paper is in fact going to speak a lot of things about this particular aspect of how we can incorporate women's contribution. And then the other paper which is going to be discussed in the seminar today itself is Bindu Verghese paper, Dr. Bindu Verghese, who is the assistant director in Kerala Planning Board, and she is going to speak about women as leaders of response and resilience during this COVID pandemic. So the role of women as a leader is again being actually going to be brought out in this particular session. So I hope that is also going to be a very fruitful session for all of us. And then tomorrow we do have actually two papers, which is very essentially nice work, especially on the ground. So one is on the cure labor and the materiality of infrastructure, which is talks about the women, the cure contribution in the laboring or labor class in Kerala. Particularly, this is a focus on the Kochi Metro case, and the other one is on domestic workers in Kerala during the COVID again pandemic situation. So that is going to be the first one is going to be taught or discussed by two scholars. One is Maitri Prasad Eliama from City University of New York, and her co-author is actually from SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. So that and the last paper, which is in fact talked about the domestic workers, is a field work based one, which was done by the faculties, different school faculties of the Central University of Tamil Nadu. My friend Sumalata and Lekha Bhatt and Chitra were doing that, and I think one of them is going to present that work. So I think almost in that sense, it's a very interesting session which we are going to have. All these are selected papers. In fact, last year also we couldn't done this thing because of the COVID pandemic, so we need to postpone the sessions. In the very beginning we are not aware of that we can actually go for an online kind of presentation, but later we thought that we will be having this in this. And the valedictory session also, we are one of the faculty from our department is going to retire, and in that session we all, actually in the last couple of years since our joining in the department, we do have actually a lot of programs in our center, and one of the Professor Abdul Salim was one of the instrumental person to have a lot of work, in fact, conducted in the department. So we also, as a token of gratitude, we would like to felicitate him also in the end, in the valedictory session, where Professor P.P. Ajay Kumar is going to talk a few word on that aspect also. So, and my fellow friends, everyone is here. So I on behalf of the organizing committee and all of us, I would like to welcome wholeheartedly all of you in this seminar. And I wish that the coming sessions are going to give us a fruitful days indeed. And with this note, let me conclude my introductory remark. Thank you all.
Thank you, Anitha ma'am, for your insights in the presidential address, and Siddik sir for your elaborate theme presentation. Now we are moving on to the inauguration. Dr. Mahadevan Pillai, our respected Vice Chancellor, Professor at the Department of Optoelectronics, Kerala University. He has contributed much to his areas of academic and non-academic activities. A person of expertise with generous gestures to the development and effectiveness of University of Kerala, I humbly VP Mahadevan Pillai to inaugurate the international webinar and to give out the inaugural address. Please, sir.
Respected Head of the Department, Dr. Anitha, Organizing Secretary, Dr. Siddik R, the Keynote Speaker, Professor Meera Velayudhan, Advisor, Gender Park, and President of Indian Association of Women Studies, respected teachers of the Department of Economics, the delegates, participants, and dear students. Good morning to all. I am very happy to know that Department of Economics, University of Kerala is organizing international webinar on women and development. Indeed, it is a pleasure to be a part of the seminar which addresses the issues of women as a central theme of development of society. The condition of women in India is often portrayed as vulnerable. The position is repeatedly refuted by many scholars in different time, citing the role of women in the ancient and Vedic scriptures. To bring this conflict into your notice, let me quote the same question Swami Vivekananda noted. You will find that in the Vedic or Upanishad age, Maitreyi and Gargi and other ladies of revered memory have taken the places of rishis through their skill in discussing about Brahman. In an assembly of thousands of Brahmanas, who were all erudites in the Vedas, Gargi boldly challenged Yajnavalkya in the discussion about Brahman. Since such ideal women were entitled to spiritual knowledge, why shall not the women have the same privilege now? In the period of degradation, when the priests made the as incompetent for the study of Vedas. They deprived the women also of all their rights. As a, we have to remember what the ancient scriptures have taught us. Yatra naristu pujyante ramande tatra devada, which means where the women are respected, there the God will reside and will be happy. The inclusion of women in the discourse of development in a global perspective under the stewardship of United Nations Development Program was dated back in the early 1970s. It is unveiled from their strategy of development, a growing awareness that women, like the poor, were peripheral to the development efforts. However, the initial inclusion named as women in development was quite myopic because the inclusion of women in development was essentially a unidirectional perspective. This was being questioned by progressive writings of women and men, and finally arrived at a mutual expression of the role of women and role of development in the process of having a better social system. To fulfill this, the UNDP adopted the Sustainable Development Goals, otherwise known as Global Goals, to have a better planet. One of the 17 goals is the goal of gender equality. The inequality based on gender and its apparent discrimination essentially act as a pull-down factor of social mobility and progress. 2020 had witnessed a massive economic crisis subsequent to contraction in the world output production due to the COVID-19 pandemic. The impacts of crisis are never gender neutral. COVID-19 lockdown measures have forced women who run small business that brings food to their tables jobless. For the domestic workers across the globe, the pandemic has meant no job and no unemployment benefits or other protection. For countless women in the economies of every size, along with losing income, unpaid care, domestic work burden has multiplied. While everyone is facing the unprecedented challenges due to lockdown and imposed social distancing, women are bearing the brunt of the economic and social fallout of COVID-19. Women who are poor and marginalized face an even higher risk of COVID-19 transmission and fatalities, loss of livelihood, and increased domestic violence. From the perspective of economic development, though we do not theoretically segregate based on gender, the issue of women being deprived and need some focus. The seminar, therefore, largely focuses on how women are being deprived and discriminated from both her economic and social life, though her contribution remains positive, just like opposite gender. In the time of the COVID-19 pandemic, women are in the forefront, better than their counterparts, to fight and reclaim a world worth living. Therefore, the discussion on women and development try to critically examine the reciprocal nature of women and their role in development and vice versa. The Department of Economics and University of Kerala is the best known for its gender composition, both in terms of students and faculty members. And their contribution is a mark of commitment in line with the UN Sustainable Development Goal. We cherish the role of women in social transformation process. The topic of the webinar is thus highly relevant. I hope the vibrant discussions on various aspects of the women and development will happen in the coming sessions of deliberations on women work and entrepreneurship. Experts from India and abroad are deliberating upon different areas. Professor Meera Velayudhan is going to speak on the question of land rights of women in the Indian context. He is definitely, and it is hopeful. It will definitely give an insight into the current understanding of the property positions of women in India. And I hope the presentations of Dr. Anitha Matthew from United Nations University would share some valuable thoughts on the role of women in business enterprises. The presentations of Dr. Bindu Varghese of Kerala State Planning Board on women as leaders of response and resilience perhaps address the issue of anxiety shared by the US. The topic of Maitri Prasad Eliama from City University of New York with Lars Artsberg from School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London, addressing the cure question and employment in Kerala, may provide an excellent perspective of how we marginalize the sections who are very much part and parcel of our life. I hope the presentations on domestic workers in Kerala during the pandemic, a situation analysis from dignity and rights perspective may enlighten all the participants. I hope at the end we all may benefit to be a better human being who work for a better Kerala and a better society. With this, I declare the International Webinar on Women and Development is inaugurated. I extend my sincere wishes for the successful conduct of the event. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir, for your perspective on the matter. Now we are moving on to the felicitation session, and
There is a small.
so you're not audible.
Hello. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Announcement. Dr. S. Naseeb, our syndicate member, and Professor Gopchandran sir, both had actually joined another meeting, so they may not be actually giving a felicitation right now. So they will be eventually join in the valedictory address. So now we can move to the
vote of thanks
speech.
Keynote speaker. Okay, sir.
Please introduce Professor Meera Velayudhan.
Yes, ma'am. Dr. Meera Velayudhan has been involved in gender studies since its inception in India in early 1980s, to an extent conducted within the discipline of history. Her doctoral research focused on gender, caste, social reform, nationalism, and popular movements in Kerala. The nucleus of her research is women's struggles and forms of organization in varied historical contexts, both pre-independence and contemporary. Her work experience includes international organizations such as UNICEF. She also prepared voluntarily an annotated bibliography of studies on women and development. Dr. Meera is a senior policy analyst and a gender expert. I'm privileged to blissfully welcome Dr. Meera Velayudhan to deliver the keynote address on women's rights to land. Please, ma'am.
I'll thank you very much, Honorable Vice Chancellor, members of the syndicate, Professor Anitha, head of the department, and all the faculty members, Siddik, who's a family friend, who's organizing this international workshops. I had earlier, he had also invited me, and I just couldn't take time to come. So I'm really happy to participate in this international conference, particularly because when gender studies sort of emerged in India, it is economics as a discipline and sociology, which really, developed, looked into gender issues. So I'm really glad that in Kerala also, the economics department is taking off. And I've seen your program too, very significant kind of presentations are there in the next, all your programs which I had looked at, and the participants which are there, and the presenters also. And unfortunately, what's happening is Gender Park is also having an international conference since yesterday for 3 days, and on women entrepreneurship and sustainable development. But I will definitely come into in between to listen to some of your presentations in some sessions, both Maitri's as well as the one today, maybe in the afternoon also. I'll try to come in to see on entrepreneurship and the board. So I'd really like to, why I've chose this Women and Land is because one is that, of course, there's a farmer's struggle that is ongoing. But more than that, it is also because Kerala also has had a very significant history of land reforms and land struggles. All India, they have been in the pre-independence period, present movements and varied movements related to, but the whole gender part of it in terms of women's right to land, that discussion, even in Kerala, it's really not taken off. And about 5-6 years back, I remember a sort of women's organization meeting in Trivandrum I had held, and I was told that it's not really an issue here at that stage. But now I find that there is much more articulation of the issue, but still the debate on women's land rights in terms of women are sort of farmers in agriculture in varied ways. They might be leasing in, leasing out, or own a plot or work in family farms. In varied ways, they are farmers. And at an all India level also, we have been, when the Land Acquisition Act was being enacted by the UPA government, we'd also lobbied and sent in recommendations on women's land rights on that period. Recognition of women as farmers in varied ways, not only because they own land, but they're farmers in varied ways. So I think this discussion, that's why I have a PowerPoint presentation, and I thought I should bring it into a discussion in Kerala itself, so that somehow this discussion needs to take off on women's land. Resource rights, there are a lot of discussion on women's resource rights, but women's land rights has really not taken off in any significant manner in Kerala. Whereas all India, it has taken off in varied states. There are networks, there are struggles, there are even advocacy groups, lobby groups. So, so I'll just present that and hopefully get a discussion going. I won't be able to, because of the time limit, I won't be able to give all the references and also the international conventions which are sort of relate to women's land rights, to which India is signatory, but I'll share that with the department. and with Siddik. And here I just want to present the kind of debate and all the kind of studies which have thrown up the land rights. The significant thing on India is that women's land rights, and internationally, there's a whole range of studies based. It's a very informed debate. So therefore, I would like to really put this forward to the. I'll just put it the PowerPoint.
Slideshow आपको
Can you see it? The slides?
Yes, madam.
Oh, you can see it, no?
Yeah.
Okay. I've let's see. Let's see. I have to see. Yes. I've titled it Women's Rights and Entitlement to Land. And it's actually the debate which was raised by varied internationally and nationally by both at the UN systems level as well as in movements from the 70s. That is, 70s also is a period when the UN took up focusing on women, and the UN conferences on women started every 10 years. There is this UN conference on women, and the Mexico conference in 1975, and varied kind of movements. One of the slogans there was in terms of women do 67% of the world's work, earn 5% of the income, and own only 1% of the world's property. And I remember as a student at that time that there used to be a whole lot of posters of this kind and that. And also the 70s in India, when India, it was actually, it did not, the Status of Women Committee report, which actually was initiated by the government, a committee set up to look at status of women in middle of the 1970s. Its report was very significant, but got lost in the emergency in that time. And it noted varied trends, particularly in terms of how some of the promises of independence which were there were not kept, and there was certain decline in varied sectors, including sex ratio. And one of the things that it said is that how female cultivators, had a decrease in female cultivators, and women agricultural labor had increased. So that really sort of pointed to some kind of changes taking place on women in agriculture. So, and it also identified land reforms as a key measure to improve the lives of rural women. And in the 1980s and 1990s, internationally also, there was a kind of shift in the approach. And in the debate in international forums, as well as in the movements, popular movements in particularly in developing countries which were taking place, and how the large sections of women in developing countries were rural and dependent on agriculture. And therefore the analysis of women and development in that period sort of shifted to a focus on rural women at that particular. And it was also acknowledged that women were denied rights in access, ownership, and control of land. And also statistics showed that there were few who had direct ownership of land in their own right. And there was also very little data at that time in terms of the gender asset gaps within, say, even within a country or across countries in that region. And internationally, we have, agencies, they have, like you have SDGs now. In that time also very sort of perspectives which sort of come because they impact the national discourse and policies, and also civil society groups which are working in rural areas also, and which sort of relate with international support or funding. The livelihood in the 1990s, one of the focus was a livelihood perspective, and this was very significant and varied not only in disciplines, but also in multilateral, bilateral agencies, grassroots organizations, and policymakers. And so there was some kind of discussion on what is the kind of agrarian chain that took place in post-colonial societies of the developing countries. And one of the things was to look at the approach that developed was to look at rural life as being integrated, located in specific contexts, cross sectors, and informed by field action and engagements. So this was a very significant. And the gender analysis in this livelihood approach actually created the space for gender analysis to emerge, and how gender relations was interlinked with the broader process of change. So a very significant aspect that has come up, and I think in Kerala, because of the matrilineal discussion, this is very important, is because the household, it really opened up the whole concept of the household as a kind of, unitary kind of concept to how it had it had variations, and how also they in different kind of households in different regions, different contexts, how do they link with the broader economic and political structures. It also opened up livelihood about how you look at rural markets as social, political, and as also unequal, being unequal. And then also the role of institutions, be it the state or the market or communities, diverse communities, how they manage natural resources, and were these institutions, were they gender neutral, or were they gender sensitive, or they were, discriminatory. So it is in this kind of debate and struggles that women's entitlement to land and other land-based resources began to be addressed since the mid-1990s. And in this, one of the things that the varied networks which we've conducted studies is to show that one is to show to various sections and to bring the informed knowledge that why entitlements matter. So one of the things which came up is that the key factor linked with rural poverty was land. And arable land has been analyzed, in the narratives also, women from rural areas, it comes out of how it is the main, most valued form of property for its economic, political, and symbolic, in the sense that identities are also linked with land. Farmers' identities, how we can see in this farmers' struggles, how they are so much linked, their own identity is so much linked with the land, and how arable land is livelihood sustaining as an asset, and where regions where agriculture dominates livelihood, land is very important for reducing the risk of poverty and enhancing food security. So women who own land and control assets are better positioned to improve their lives and cope, particularly in face when there are crisis situations. And also where these are all based on studies conducted by women's land rights networks and movements. By owning land and homes, women directly gain benefits of using land, earning an income, and also have security of a place to live. And research has shown, even in Kerala, that those who own land generate a much higher non-farm earnings from self-employment than people without land. Women can also use land as collateral for credit during crisis, or also for investing in other income generating work, in the sense that you can diversify your, if you are able to have that kind of collateral, to diversify your skill and your work also. And also studies in Kerala itself has shown that how property and asset ownership have led to better nutrition in terms of survival of the household, education, the amount of investment that households put into education of children, and also the nutrition and health of the children, because women are able to sort of decide the cropping, etc. So when women go into that, into cultivation, they definitely focus on food crops. And also a study of marginal farmer households in Kerala shows that mothers' cultivation of a home garden. I think this now the Kerala government is and has been promoting this all the varied schemes related to kitchen gardens and small plots around the house, and how it had actually improved nutrition, particularly of children. And particularly also that it can also gives how various economic shocks and social risks, how it sort of gives a kind of support. You can draw support during these kind of economic shocks and social risks. And therefore, particularly in Kerala, if you look at the migration, or in areas where there are conflicts, or where women are abandoned, or where there's violence against women, or there's women divorce, or there are polygamous relationships, or illness, HIV, AIDS, or death. In that, how these entitlements are very significant. And in regions which are in India itself, hunger and chronic undernutrition, in sort of, even if you look at the studies on Attapadi area where there had been starvation deaths earlier, women often are the main food growers. And you can see that there are studies on Attapadi and some of the tribal areas in Kerala itself, how because of losing of land, as well as landed, and changes in cultivation patterns have led to sort of lack of food and nutrition. And even now, rural women are responsible for half of the food production in developing countries. They produce about 60 to 80% of the food. And there's been secure land tenure is very significant. And in terms of, improving the agricultural productivity and land improvement. The moment that security is there, then more kind of significance is given to, and also it ensures better productivity and also access to various programs. So it's sort of very critical. This whole livelihood approach actually brought out how land and was a critical productive asset and source of livelihood for rural poor women, which is predominant in development, particularly South Asia and developing countries. And so therefore the women who in varied ways that they are involved in agriculture, they play a significant role in household subsistence. And there are also, the studies also brought out how there are the female-headed household. Kerala has got a very large section of female statistics, female-headed single women in varied ways. Not just, there are those who are not just who are unmarried, but also deserted or who are sort of their husband, the family male members have migrated in varied ways. Deserted single women, there's a large section in Kerala in particular, and India itself, it's about 25 to 30 female-headed households, and there are households, increasingly households where conflict areas like communal violence or other kind of conflicts which are taking place. In India, in many areas, these female-headed households are growing. And then there are different categories. As I had mentioned earlier, that singleness is varied and very diverse. So therefore, when you say single women, it's not just unmarried women, or there are also those who may choose not to marry. So single. There's a whole discussion now on women, single women and land rights, which are also going on, and how ownership of land creates possibilities to stand on their own feet, and even if support from relatives, if you have that kind of asset basis. And also they sort of serve as collateral for other benefits. And this has been in the Land Acquisition Act. One of the things that we had put forward is how access to credit and finance, how whether it's just titles or there should be, in different ways, if women are recognized as farmers and have that farmer's card, whether even if they don't own it, but they are accessing it, then it sort of gives them access to credit. So, so the interlinkages of varied levels of recognition of women's work in the in farming, in agriculture, that also gives them access to. If that recognition is there, then it gives them access to credit and varied sort of finances, loans, or say when a crop fails, crop failure supports, which can be accessed, even if the titles are not there, if they're accepted as women farmers in varied ways. And also where male migration is high, women, they are the main rural agriculture, and therefore the government programs should also need to support these women who are sort of dependent on, who are actually principal farmers in many areas because of this high male migration. There have been studies of Himachal Pradesh and various other, this is very significant. Then what is the ways in which women access? There are different ways in which women can or do or they do not access land, but there are varied ways. And one is the inheritance, and the second is transfer from state, like land distribution, or housing distribution. Then also purchase from the market. And here I have sort of gone into, we've done studies of not only India, but also South Asia in particular, to show that what are the different ways in which women access, or what determines their access to land. And at all these, whether it's inheritance or land distribution or purchase from the market, at all these junctures, women face more obstacles than men owing to the kind of inherited practices which are there. The male privilege in marriage, gender inequality in land market, or male bias in land distribution programs, country to country, community to community, even within a region. And one of my students was doing, who I was guiding, was doing a study of in Erikadu, in Patnamthitta district, Dalit colony, which sort of got formed with land reforms. And there we found, we were tracing how what the social mobility of Dalit households in that area. And we found that during the land reforms, actually out of 125 sort of households which got land, that is in that area, there were actually about 30 women, single women who were also given land. Although it was not a part of the debate of land reforms in Kerala at that time, but there was a kind of distributive and fairness in some of the areas, but in other areas where land reforms and distribution in Kerala studies, not everywhere the single women, this percentage, it's very varied. So unless you have a very pronounced kind of policy on that, it doesn't automatically that in distribution that whether it's housing or land, whether it will go to say single women or in the name of female-headed households, it might go to the son or to an uncle. So in most inheritance practices are such that traditionally don't own property, since land is inherited through the female line. And in most cultures, inheritance practices are patrilineal. In Kerala also, we found that Irudaya Rajan has his studies were in some areas, in Thrissur area, where matrilineal, where there was a practice even till very late of land. In practice, land was given to female members, even when whether they are getting married, the land is definitely as part of their share. Even there, these sort of shifts were taking place more into patrilineal and practices and denial of these, and the emergence of dowry, in fact, from matrilineal to sort of moving into patrilineal and patriarchy and dowry systems. And customary laws, for instance, in many countries are related to marriage and bar women from obtaining primary rights to land. Rather, they only have use rights are there. For instance, in Nagaland, there are use rights which are there but it's all through the male members, fathers, husbands, or brothers, that there are use rights, but not really ownership, primary rights to land. And however, access is not the same as ownership, and since you don't have ownership, your social protection also weakens, because it's just access that you have. Say if you're going and you are just leasing in some land, or you're just working on somebody else's small farm, then since there is not ownership, the social protection sort of is lessened. And in most countries, legally, of course, women can purchase land on the market, but because of the weak asset bases and high degree of economic dependence, these sort of prevent women from sort of accessing even they create barriers to even the market. And often they have to take the permission of the as male members before committing family resources. And so this sort of in a way that resource use gets affected, because there is a lower motivation for women to invest in the land they use. For instance, irrigation in land rehabilitation programs. Unless there is that kind of asset ownership and base, the motivation to invest in land use also is limited. And this we have seen in many, even in Gujarat, some of the irrigation project studies and where rehabilitation is taking place in Sardar Naro, the various dams which have created land assetlessness and landlessness by rehabilitation program. Some of these studies have brought this out because there's no titling and there's no asset ownership. So the motivation to sort of also declines. Then also, even where locally women do get entitlement to land, they may be reluctant to access it for fear of losing, say, family support. The brothers may not like it, or the male members, or they feel that if they are in their marital home, if they ask for land from their natal homes, then maybe their support in the family, their natal family, may decline. And this in some of the areas in my own study of Muslim women's rights in the tribal area in Gujarat also, there is a custom of giving women land, even when they are sort of, but increasingly what was happening is the women were finding it, they were becoming reluctant to demand also, for fear that they may not get support from the family if they are crisis in their marital homes. And India studies show that daughters often waive their land rights in favor of brothers to avoid being termed as selfish in the not only in the community itself. They'll say if you try to demand these rights, not only within the community but also even the land administration. And we, in our studies, have shown when they go to the land administration and try to access their rights, the talati or the revenue officials, they will sort of say, "Why do you want to do this? You won't get any support. Your family is against. And who will be there for your support?" So there are waiving. They sort of waive their rights, and in fact, from these the documents of land titling, the inheritance titling, they get removed, and where they also they forgo their claims, and also there's relatives which sort of forge wills and file court, use threats and violence for discouraging women from claiming their shares. In fact, there is the studies have shown this witch hunting. A lot of the witch hunting, women are sort of targeted as witches, and in particularly in many of these tribal areas, and there it had a lot of it had gone to do with widows and who have sort of claiming in the property, I mean land. So even if there are smaller plots, and so they get demonized and isolated as witches because they are sort of making these demands. So this also show that how society itself can target, and in varied ways if women demand their entitlements within the family itself. And in also there are also socio-political systems are very important in the kind of social political systems which have evolved over times, and sometimes in South Asia, for instance, inheritance patterns within land vary even within a region or between countries and region, religion, caste, community, ethnicity. So these all inform the inheritance patterns. And in India, for instance, because you have you have personal laws also, which are there. And these sort of merge with the local histories and give a particular character to inheritance patterns. And so these are sort of norms and institutions, cultural practices constrain women from claiming and controlling land, and they vary. And so these sort of disadvantage women in certain women more than in certain regions than others. And particularly agricultural land in the legal tenures, enactments in different states. In fact, the positives are that southern states have more positive tenural enactments in terms of daughters' inheritance rights. Most of the South Indian states have more positive kind of changes have taken place. And colonial legacies have been, like inheritance, and they were sort of perceived as personal laws of communities. And this sort of colonial heritage continues even now. And laws have often accommodated customary, religious, all levels. Sometimes they've accommodated customary practices. Sometimes religious practices have been included in the law. Sometimes pluralist traditions have been included in the laws that are inherited. And so, and also inheritance to land, particularly agricultural land, have been most difficult to enact. And if you look at India, that the Hindu Code Bill on which Baba Sahib Ambedkar resigned from the government in independent India because of this rights of daughters in the family property, and there was so much of strong opposition. Although Jawaharlal Nehru had initially agreed to the act itself, with Baba Sahib Ambedkar had drafted, there was so much of opposition. Particularly now we have a farmer struggle going on, and Punjab was one of the strongest where women's land rights. Even now, it is a very big issue in that area. And Punjab also, those are the regions which have very low sex ratio. Sex ratios are very discriminatory. So therefore, these kind of debates need to be, and it's only in 2005 that these, after 56, so after 56 in 2005 only, one could amend, and these sort of that amendment overrided the tenurial laws of different states and enabled daughters, including those who are married, to become co-partners in joint family property. And in Kerala, it's equal in terms of the law, equal rights to all every individual has equal rights, but in practice, that's not what takes place. And South Asia, there are studies have also looked at what is it that is conducive to women being able to exercise land rights, and what are the kind of resistance that comes up. So one saw that in the studies, South Asia in particular and Southeast Asia, that South India, Northeast India, South India, Sri Lanka, Nepal. Nepal, particularly the new constitution, there was a huge debate on women's land rights, and it has been incorporated in the new constitution following the end of monarchy in Nepal. In areas where women marry either in the natal villages or nearby villages, and or where close kin marriages prevail. And so these are the sort of areas where it's more conducive to, and where the Parda system does not exist, and where women's labor force participation is either sort of medium or little higher level. These are areas where there are less resistance to women's entitlements to land. Except in Nepal, where these areas contain traditionally matrilineal and bilateral communities. There is some history of matrilineal and mixed bilateral kind of customs and community practices. Regions where women face most resistance to claims are North India, particularly North, Punjab, Haryana, Rajasthan, UP. These are now the strongest area of the farmer struggles. And this Bangladesh, Pakistan, and although, for instance, where marriages are far from natal villages or close-kin marriages are forbidden, as in, a lot of these honor killings which have taken place also have got to do with this, kinship within what kinship can marriages take place, and they've also got to do with property rights and where parda and stricter controls are there over female sexuality. In those areas, the adverse, these are resistance areas to women's access to land. And female labor, in regions where female labor force participations are low, and inequalities in private land ownership are high, and common lands which are eroding are also limited and disappearing. These are also areas where women lose out in terms of rights. Actually, in terms of religion, Islam actually sanctions inheritance rights. It's in the religion itself. There is these inherent rights are there, but because of the practices which takes place, where strong control over sexuality, female seclusion. So much of the advantage that Islam as a religion sanctions get sort of eroded because of these sort of cultural practices and control over sexualities. And then the access is through sort of land distribution, various laws or policy or public land, which involve public land distribution, as in India. And be it poverty alleviation or schemes for land distribution or for resettlement, conceptual biases sometimes sort of impact their implementation. So the notions of household and community are very significant in these implementers. And also, recently there was about 2 years back, there was in Kerala, the planning board had held a meeting because the SC subplan funds were getting lapsing. And there was this meeting of women panchayat presidents and district panchayat presidents, and I had also attended that meeting at that time. And it said that the notion in terms of even why the funds for SC subplans in terms of whether it's housing or it's water supply or building a road was because the notion of the household, the way the composition, the way the community lived, they lived, many sort of family members lived in larger, the settlement of these communities was specific to, say, independent household. And so even the notion of what is what is a household? Does it have many members, or it is just one structure that is a household? So therefore, when land is distributed, and when you see household as a homogeneous or a community as homogeneous, or as a united collection of households, as a unitary, then it creates problems in terms of allocation. Unit allocation of resources get affected in that sense. So there have been studies on Operation Barga in Bengal, because Bengal had serious land reforms which undertaken. And my she's passed away sociologist Joyati Gupta, Professor Joyati Gupta, she had conducted very detailed study of this area in Bengal, and how giving land to land. There was a very strong male bias in registering, even tenants or giving land to landless. In Midnapur, found that 98% of holdings distributed went to men. About 90% female-headed household, the land was given to the women's sons. No married women received joint titles, although it is a Government of India policy and to have joint titles since 1980s. Joint titles are there because of the lobbying by women's movement itself. And so the Amartya Sen in his work has actually challenged this whole model of the household and how about intra-household gender relations, So looking at the Indian experience, he has pointed out about conflicts of interest that exist within households. He also held that household is most usefully represented as a case of cooperative conflict within the household itself. There's cooperation, and then there's also a sort of conflict in terms of asset ownership, And the solution suggested was it depends on the bargaining ability of the couple. However, in a couple, the bargaining ability is not equal, the power is not equal. And self-worth and, in addition to self-worth, there are two important factors that determine sort of a bargaining power, say, within the household. And they include the ability of each members to earn an income or bring a valued resource into the household, and also whether that household values that contribution. So therefore, then Bina Agarwal, who's really a pioneer in women's land rights, and I will share with you, with the department, all the references of these studies. She said that we need to, even if you look at the household, you have to look at the areas of power relations in which women are located, which are not just only within the household. And there are a large number of institutions which are gendered. And these include communities, labor market, property institution, judicial systems, land administration, and local governance itself. And recent studies have focused on gender as social relations, as sort of, looking at subjectivities and how there are shared and separate interests within a household, which what Amartya Sen had said about cooperative conflict. There are shared interests, but there are also separate interests within households, and power resides in these material assets as well as in the kind of discourse that you have, or the kind of perceptions within the household and the kind of discussions that they go on, and in society itself, And so this sort of made women's struggles for land much more complex. This sort of so then Amartya Sen, as well as then later Bina Agarwal, who had worked with him also, and now very pioneering studies, have said brought out these through varied studies how because of this household composition and the interests which are there, which are shared as well as which are separate, and how power relations, not only within the household, outside itself, impact. So therefore, that makes the struggle for women's land rights much more complex. And so the market, for instance, which affects, women lack finances, sort of collaterals. And also, how can they act as individuals in accessing the market? Do they have that kind of positioning to act as individuals to access the market? So, there's spaces are also gendered. Mobility, and then activities outside the household, be it market interaction or to seek information about new agricultural practices. I remember when I was doing a study of Kuttanadu on movements in Kuttanadu some 3 years back, when I was interviewing the women involved in who were leasing in land, small plots, who were leasing land. One of the women, when I was talking, said that, "Can you tell me about organic farming?" So just to get information on these kind of practices itself, because of the gendered kind of spaces which are there, do they have access to that kind of information or to purchase inputs or selling agricultural products, And so this sort of limited, because of this gendering of these spaces, mobility, and it sort of limits their ability to undertake farming independently and to attain maximum productivity. And studies also show that when they're dealing this, in fact, there are many studies, including Bina Agarwal, and also some of the studies undertaken in other parts of India by different people who are involved in networks and so on. They have shown that how group collective sort of are one of the ways in which land markets as a group, it's much more positive. Land pooling, for instance, very interesting case in a tribal area in in Gujarat, where the land is it's banned that land cannot be given to non-Adivasis, and there was this mortgaging a household which had was sort of at the point of mortgaging their land because of sort of a lot of financial and other kind of agriculture stress which was there, and the women sort of pooled in their labor and they did collective farming over there. And there's also land pooling which has taken place, and how they manage even small, how you can manage small size fragmented kind of fragmentation also can be sort of avoided with this pooling and with collective kind of farming. In Kerala also this is joint liability groups are very successfully doing even the Kudumbashri groups in terms of collective farming, and they're sort of reviving agriculture in many areas, even in Kerala. So this collective approach and group approach has, even in leasing land, you can access then you this sort of individuals who have financial constraints as a group, it's possible. And there are many cases, and this also makes the whole argument about that smaller size plots are not viable. In fact, these have shown that they are viable, and with women's entitlement and rights, they do become viable with the support systems that are given, and they can and the financial access, and they can access funds for capital investment, take advantage of economies of scale, and they can come together for labor sharing and to market their produce. Where land is held collectively, the group will use rights, but not the right to alienate in case of pressure from male family members. They cannot alienate in this group the land, because there's still that pressure from male family members, but they will still have the use rights which are there. And since 1990s, there have been varied platforms. I myself was part of the only network on women's land rights statewide when I was earlier settled in Gujarat, and and then gone across to many other states, and these have led to many alliances and coalitions in African countries, for instance, and even in Nepal. They were part of the new democracy movements, and so therefore where constitutions were being set up and were being designed and enacted, and where this women's land rights have been part of this democracy movements also. So in the post-90s, these have been very significant. Nepal is much more recent. And the women, because a large number of women also who were elected to the assembly, and the movements, the preceding peasant struggles which sort of inform the constitution making. So therefore, the platforms, networks are very significant. There are different ways in which lobbying and engagements can take different levels, which can take place. And there are a lot of learnings which have come from grassroots experiences, and that relate to sort of how claims have to be enforceable, and the ownership and rights of use need to be guaranteed too. Rights have to have a legal, they should be a legal right, and they should be enforceable also. And so to rent or to give it to somebody or to sell property, these sort of rights, there has to be not only legally, but it has to be also implemented and enforceable also. Then there's also differences in application of customary and statutory laws. The way customary and the way that there could be a barrier to guarantee of property rights, where uh, there's a combination of customs, statutory laws may be there, but customs predominate, a certain customs. So there could be sort of barriers which sort of take place to that. And so I think this is one of the crucial things about how do sort of amend and sort of harmonize statutory and customary laws, which are sort of give women those entitlements and rights. Those are very significant. And in the Northeast, some of the studies which are coming up and the struggles which are going on. Uh, for instance, Nagaland, a huge struggle, because Nagaland, it's very interesting that women have use rights on land, and women are the primary cultivators. In the tribal, it comes under another, under the constitutional thing where tribal councils are there, but very strongly, historically also, women are not part of any communities, any decision-making bodies. And recently, when there was this huge struggle took place, a huge backlash of women's representation in representative bodies and backlash, and they've still not got that, despite use rights and the significant role. And so there are very interesting sort of diversities and studies which are sort of, I don't have time to go into all those in details. Then legal literacy is very important. And also, see, governmental Assam, one of the studies that we had conducted in Assam, very interesting that some areas come under the schedule, which sort of gives tribal councils have the right to governance in those areas. And then there is parts of Assam which sort of come under the Indian state laws. So, for instance, to access government programs on land, say some benefits for land, for instance, you need individual titles. So the land is given to individual title. So what was there as collective earlier, so therefore in these tribal councils, which had sort of used to have use rights for various households, which are sort of given out, then the dominant sections in the tribal councils made it private property. So how a national kind of laws and enactment can also erode more collective and more distributive kind of practices which were there. And in the case of Assam, it came forward like that. And I think now there are much more intense kind of with the national level intervention and industrialization sort of shifting to Northeast, the resource and a very rich resource area, and all the corporates and industries going there. It's sort of really huge sort of changes and struggles are ongoing over there. And in fact, the citizenship struggle, which is ongoing and in Northeast, are very much got to do with these asset bases of people and how you want to eliminate one section because of it creating competition for resource bases and for livelihoods. And so legal literacy has been very significant, even in the women's land rights networks. It's through legal literacy that we, in fact, even found out what are the different kinds of discriminations that are, what are the perceptions that are there. And also, what are the kind of support organization that can enable women to make the claim. So, for instance, women who are elected members. In Kutch, for instance, where I was settled for about 10 years, there is a very strong civil society movements, and the organized women who are elected members as into organizations. And if those sections, women who are there, who are elected, understand the asset bases and livelihood, the claims and entitlements of women, then in terms of accessing the support system, that support that you need in terms of the barriers you face, whether at the family level or the community level, these sort of such organizations and such kind of even decision-making bodies, women there, these can sort of facilitate that access. So, for instance, in Kerala, with so many women in the local level governance, if there is a huge awareness created about women's resource and land rights and asset bases, if that kind of awareness is created, so these individual women who are struggling for various, whether they're deserted or single women in various ways, you can imagine the kind of support that could be there and how movement can go forward for women's entitlement and land rights. So it's very, very sort of significant to give that kind of, legal and women's land rights perspective, the insights, and that kind of education to elected bodies and other kind of organizations which can enable women to make these claims. And we have the women's land rights have tried this successfully in many areas also. Then recording of women's share of land. We found that the land record, which is called Sadbara 712, is the document in which your share in all the recordings are done. This land recordings which are done, individual family households. So in Gujarat, in fact, we tried, and in terms of changing that form in which, like, if a marriage sort of takes place, automatically the name should be entered in that document. That recording should be there at varied levels. And so therefore that recording, then it's possible to take recourse to making claims. So how recording is such a complicated process. The form itself is so complicated, and so therefore these kind of land administration and land recording information and that kind of awareness is very much necessary. And this should be done in Kerala, for instance, could be done at the local levels in terms of the new elected members' awareness. Newer sections are coming into elected bodies, and they are less aware of these kind of regulations and laws. And so therefore, this kind of understanding and this kind of awareness of how recording itself can change. So women can make those claims. And joint titles also, there's a discussion which has been going on about whether it should be joint titles or sort of, what is called bhagedari. I mean, you have your own share in that. One section in the household will be in your name. It's not just only joint, or you have sort of separate shares, but that there was a debate on that that is sort of going on about joint titling, and sort of how it should protect you against men. It is male, the studies show, who sell off the land. And also again dispossession through, say, separation, desertion, divorce. Therefore, if you have your own share in that, it sort of increases your bargaining power in the household, and even in decisions in farming, in crop that you select, the crops that you select. Studies have shown that women go more for food crops rather than cash crops, and men will straight away go into cash crops and into fertilizers and so on. So it is to sort of mandatory, this joint for legally, for married, sort of for couples, sort of joint titles should be made sort of mandatory. And collective approaches, that I said studies women can support in varied kind of, I had earlier mentioned this collective approaches which are there. Then sort of the kind of transition, social change needs much more investigation. What is happening, to what are the transition, particularly matrilineal society to patrilineal and patriarchies and Northeast. I have a separate paper some other time maybe on these kind of changes which are taking place, and into how these economic changes in cultivation practices because of migration or cultural, say, upward mobility or influence of urbanization, how these sort of social processes, how they have an impact. These need much more investigation. And this Nagaland, this I've just cited this customary logs of interpretation of this law. Customary laws, who interprets it? Even if it is, say, sort of not discriminatory one, customary law, but who interprets it? So their sort of interface with modernity, is it in their favor, or in whose favor is it? And the Meghalaya self-acquired, various enactments even in some of these regions which give property to son or daughter according to their will. So earlier it was from matrilineal, so it shifts into where it can be given to a son or a daughter according to the will of the, so given the biases that are there, you can imagine where it will go. And the national legislation, community ownership to rights have not sort of been upheld, except of course somewhat in the tribal bill, in the Forest Act, some bit of these rights have been ensured, but basically it's perceived as state's property, and the power to alienate land from traditional communities. And you can see the huge kind of lacks of Adivasis who have been made, saying that they are illegally staying in their own land. Recent Supreme Court enactment has taken place. And how it's sort of anybody can alienate and say what was where they have for generations occupied those lands. They are being saying that you are sort of not allowed to stay here anymore. You're occupying. It's illegal. The Supreme Court itself is saying these. And also, like how these, because of these states, the way it's not looked alienated from traditional communities which are there. So there are a lot of changes in resource use, the way the land use, and they've also led to crisis and huge social impact. And increasingly also in some of these, the control by men and individual main ownership, it's moving towards more, and state encouraging commercial crops and loans given to individual farmers and heads of household men. So process of change to individual male ownership in many cases are taking place. Then the governance, like I had said, that the sixth schedule, there's a threat of, land is also very much linked with identity. And, this, there are women who had gone into, from Uttarakhand, there was this stories of the narratives of women who had gone into landless and finally ended up in brothels in Mumbai and many other metropolitan cities. Their narrative said it's only these grand green lands that can give us security and nothing else. They say, So therefore, this land alienation and to non-tribals and the state recognition of individual ownership. So this also prepares the ground for land alienation. And many areas do not have just a single tribe. Northeast, in fact, the conflict, a lot of this conflict is also the way the geographic is got consolidated into a state or a region. And that sort of the demarcations from colonial period itself created conflict within communities. And then there is a whole issue of customary laws are dynamic, they're changing. And there is attempts also in the name of identity of a community that you try to have a uniform customary law in the name of unity or even national integration or whatever, and then sort of erode women's rights within that. And so it is a need to look at live situation on the ground, how customary law is being practiced in specific contexts in terms of access, ownership, control of land, other land-based resources. And I think intersectionality is how land rights, I think the biggest learnings which we have had in the women's land rights movements is that how gender, we have get a better understanding of gender when you even look at women's land and resource rights. The understanding of gender and the intersectionalities and your understanding really widens gender understanding of how you define gender itself. And so how it sort of intersects with inheritance practices, privatization of community and indigenous lands, as well as gendered control over economic resources and rights to work. So I don't have time. Actually, I had also, I can share it later with the department. I'd gone into a whole section on how the 5-year plans from when the plan document started to right up to the planning in till the the UPA time when the planning process was on. Now there's no planning in the central government level. There's no planning in that sense. And so how the conceptual shifts sort of took place in terms of women's access and rights to land, how in the different kind of plan and programs, how conceptual shifts took place because of also engagement of various networks and women's struggle on lands and lobbying. And so therefore the planning process is very significant because there's a democratic element to it. It has to be debated at many levels. These the planning and policy document, they need to be public documents, and public need to respond with their debate should be there and should be answerable to representative bodies, the parliament. What has happened now is that you have a parliament where constitutional amendments just, which actually had huge debates earlier, now just get passed in an hour or so. And so therefore the democratic process, what's happening to the democratic process is very significant because it affects the planning and the policies that are coming up, and the spaces for consultation and debates have also narrowed. The consultative process earlier in all the plan, when even the budget making process, there used to be women economists used to be part of that, the planning, various committees which were set up by the planning commission, and so therefore that kind of process, those are no longer there anymore. And then therefore advocacy, and I think in the Kerala context, this I've been sort of saying, I had chaired the 13th plan document which we created, and at that stage, that what is different in Kerala compared with other kind of states is a lack of lobby group on various gender issues. You have individual sort of demands, but there's no strong lobby informed sort of group that can continuously, respond to various plans, programs, designs, which are sort of linked with grassroots movements, in that kind of need for that advocacy, a strong advocacy group, and also the question of political will at the state and the central level. It's very difficult now to talk about it, but that kind of political will, which is very significant. So I'll sort of end with that, and I would like to really acknowledge, because I was part of this women working group on women and land ownership. It's the only state level network in Gujarat which we formed in 2003, and still we're going strong. We were able to impact we did trainings of talatis, the revenue clerks, on land rights. We also were in the panchayat training centers, modules were created on women's land rights, and sort of many ways, different ways. Although, the political system was so strong in that area, there are varied ways in which that one needs to engage, and that seriously needs to be thought, particularly now in today's context, at how do you engage, at what levels you engage, and there has to be serious thought has to be given to that. So I'd really like to acknowledge the working group on women and land ownership. I myself was from its initiative involved in that, and it's very strong now also. And then Dr. Beena Agarwal, she helped us even in the Gujarat itself in how to study, go about studying women's land ownership. All her publications, I will share with you articles and various things. Then for the 5-year plans, C.P. Sujaya, she was a former secretary in the 1990s in Women and Child Development Department, and she is now and she's totally unwell and created very significant So I'll end with So I'll sort of end with this happening to the sound. End with this, and I also had a section on international conventions, which are sort of conducive to which Indian state is also signatory to, which is sort of on women's land and resource rights, as well as a whole section of references, which I will share with you later. So that I'll end it here.
Thank you very much, ma'am, for giving us a very valuable session on the subject matter. And I hope you would be okay to take some questions from us.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, okay. And the participants, if anybody would like to raise doubts and questions, can post it in the chat box. It will be read out. Or if you want to ask her directly, please feel free to do so. And ma'am, I have one question in the chat box. The question: yes. How the practice of dowry in India affecting women's choice and bargaining power, over her own family, land, and wealth? The question is from Bhagya S.
Yes, I mean, it's an important point because there are, it's also linked with that. What are the areas, what are the communities or regions or areas where these practices, like what are the kind of, how are they emerging? How was that practice there earlier? That dowry practice was there earlier. And these many studies have done, and many also show how there are shifts taking place from matrilineal to patrilineal to patriarchies, and also it's also very much linked with also women sort of losing asset their say their role in agriculture, even losing their role in agriculture. Also, there are studies which show that uh, in Punjab, for instance, once the the land is acquired and farming takes place, how social mobility, how a higher kind of mobility sort of starts, women sort of are also put into kind of more restrictions take place than they earlier had. So there are many of these studies which are there which sort of show these changing. These dowry practices also are very dynamic and changing, and therefore they really increasingly any kind of even practices of giving some property to the daughter or to a sister, those are also eroding. So therefore, it's increasingly, in all the studies, it's increasingly sort of showing how, their own agency and their own even self-worth and ability to make any kind of demands get eroded. And even in Kerala, I mean, you can just look at in Kerala itself, the dowry practices, all communities. It's there among all communities and all sections. It's there very strongly, and how there are, so much of indebtedness because of, like recently I'm looking at Palghat because that has been an area where this Valayar, all that the child rapes and murders which took place, and in that area also has uh, high levels of suicides among agricultural labor, and also among area which has, sort of, because it's closer to the Tamil Nadu border, this area, it's a lot of, area of trafficking, it's area of a lot of crime in that area. And looking at that in some of the studies on inequalities and in some village studies which have sort of coming up there, has shown that how this marriage, the families of agriculture, which one area in one particular panchayat, there was about 5 or 6 suicides among agricultural labor, and from Irava community, and it had very much linked with indebtedness related to trying to marry the girl outside into, say, somebody who's working in a company in Coimbatore, and then not unable to. These are sort of borrowings apart from borrowing from cooperatives and banks and all. There are borrowings from money lenders. The impact is over there. So I think that these practices so are linked with also what's happening to agriculture, the new kind of changes, not new in the last many years. Who is now owning land, and what are the, even river sharing also come with Tamil Nadu is impacting agriculture in that area, and then the marital practices which are taking place. So there are a lot of changes which are taking place, how they're impacting, and therefore in that region, I think these Kerala, we really need to do a very strong sort of studies into. If you look into violence, you have to really look into very detailed regional studies of what's happening, to looking into violence and dowry is very much related to violence also, the suicides, those kind of things. And there are many studies which sort of, this transition that is taking place and the lowering of women's position because of the transition that's taking place, and then the violence that is growing, And so therefore, it's like this is a very important issue that you've raised, and I'll share with you the studies so that you can look at some of these studies and yourself and look at what are the changes taking place.
Thank you, ma'am. Anyone else have any questions? You can ask, we can wait for some minutes. Ma'am, me myself have one question, ma'am. You had talked about that violent side of dowry. On one side, we have violence regarding dowry, but on the other side, there are people who rename dowry as it is an asset for the daughter. So whenever they give out,
and not under the law.
Yeah,
under the law, dowry, there's very clear definition of dowry under the law.
Yes, we know that. In the ground reality, there are people who say that it's just the asset for the girls. We just give it off when they are getting married off. So how do you think?
So they give it to the girl. They
no,
don't
they
give it to the girl. Yeah, so
but
it's
still
not
they
really,
rename it like that. No.
No, the people are giving apartments. They're giving so many other things now. They've shifted to that kind of things, and it sort of creates.
But there are people in our state who consider it as a status symbol to give away large amounts as dowry. So what do you think about that, ma'am?
No, I mean, what status symbol? What when does it really empower the girl who's getting married, or is it like it's a kind of exchange for like she can only come to that household with these goods and with this property. Otherwise, she has no value of her own.
Yeah. Yes.
It's about her own value. If really given in her name and she's able to exercise her right on it on her own, it's not like that. And the definition in the law is very clear. So whether somebody interprets it that in some other way is going against the law.
Okay.
Because there are pressures. And there are also it sort of puts women in a subordinate position. And the household, and they bargain. And the woman is a commodity, She can be only exchanged with all these goods and properties.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. I hope there are no other questions left.
I have one question.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
My name is Parvati. So what I wanted to tell you is that we know that women's land rights have been strengthening, especially after the late 1990s. But
strengthening? No, I wouldn't say that.
Land rights.
The movement is strengthening.
So I believe women know very little about the specific rights with respect to, transferring land rights and also, especially in the rural areas, women know very little about these. So there is a disparity in land rights knowledge. So is there anything that can be done to this?
Yes, a lot. In fact, in the, what we found out in Gujarat was that the moment women get awareness about the land administration and land rights, they don't hesitate to demand, So we found it that with support, like I said, support systems which need to be there, And the moment that we used to hold these camps. We used to hold these, camps about land administration. And in those camps, more and more women started coming to get information. And the moment then that, that empowers them because they have the knowledge of how to go about it. Initially, you have to do that hand-holding of how to go about it. Then you have a collective strength also to support you. So that knowledge is very sort of important. I think, you don't have that kind of, even in Kerala, you don't have that kind of literacy and all is very high. But this awareness of land administration and the rights, what are the forms, which are the ways in which you access your property, So those are, those that need a lot of, capacity building, trainings at different levels, I myself have conducted for class 2 and class 1 officers in Gujarat through the state training institution on women's land rights, and particularly the role of revenue clerks. I don't know what they call them here. In Gujarat, they were called Palatis. So they do the land recording. They do the recording of titles at the local level. So different levels have to be sensitized, Even if women get sensitized to that in the land administration and at that level they're not aware of it, or their own perceptions are discriminatory, then you can find it difficult to access. So therefore, you need huge campaigns and mass campaigns and intense educational kind of, which can be done because local governance in Kerala is strong. Local governance institutions, and so therefore, if it becomes part of training methods and trainings, of all at that level. And also locally, women in these, why in the Gram Panchayats and all these levels, why cannot these awareness be made? Many areas they are doing it. There are these kind of cases which are there, But you need, you have to have organizations, mobilizations, networks. You need to have civil society responses, informed responses to go among women and engage. And when there are these institutions which are there, you influence them in their trainings, in their dialogues, in their discourse, in their policy making. At these different levels, you have to take the data from the ground and then make claims. So in the colonial period, like for instance in Gujarat, in the colonial period, there used to be these courts which were held, sort of area level court, legal courts were held, So we revived some of those, and then women would come into those courts, and then they would put different kind of claims and look at those claims. And you call the revenue officials, you maybe call some other revenue department, higher level department people, and get them to know what are the issues on the ground. So therefore, there's a lot of work to be done. Wherever they have organized and they have managed to get land and access, has been there to go through all these processes. And it's still a very far behind in Kerala. With all the positivities, of having local governance and with so many trainings ongoing. So I think that if there is that kind of strong mobilization and kind of organizations or networks, lobby groups, these are very important, different levels. And you have to learn from engagements in other areas. Increasingly, you'll find struggles are becoming very varied. The way they engage, the farmer struggle is very different from the citizenship struggle. So different ways to engage, that. And in Kerala, if you have what is considered an enabling government, then you think of ways in which you push it. But you need also an informed lobby, you need informed organizations, you need mobilizations. And land is a big issue in Kerala. So,
Madam, this is Customary. I'm faculty in economics department. So I couldn't listen to the full of the lecture, but when I was doing the field work, especially among the farmers.
Which area? Which area?
I'm in economics. I'm teaching in economics department only.
No. Where was your field work located?
It was in Trivandrum, Neyatankara region, then Alappuzha, then Thrissur. Okay. So I was doing some work with the vegetable farmers. Okay. And what we came across is that men conduct the men own the land. But once the land is prepared and everything is planted, women will be taking care of that plants to grow up. And because you have to tend every day and water the plants and other things, the women will be engaging in that kind of activities. And I tried to find some female farmers, but what happened is that the land area which they hold is very, very limited.
Small, yeah.
Very small, maybe 5 cents of land or something like that. But when you compare it with the men, what we could observe is that even if the men were not having land, they have the muscle power to go into some other regions and get the land on lease for a very high amount. Because they have that capital in their hand, so that they can move. The mobility is there. They move to some other regions and get big land area, especially the fields. When the paddy is not cultivating, then only they go for that vegetable farming. But in Alappuzha, what I have seen is that these women, they had an innovative kind of cultivating practice, because they just cultivated in the roadside, in the fallow lands, in the college grounds. Yes. So that kind of movement we could observe. Yes. But when it comes to Thrissur and other regions, it is pakka commercial agriculture. Only men will be there. Okay, so what happens is that when it comes to the productive asset, when land is considered as a productive asset, women is actually totally alienated from that field. So it is a really disheartening kind of a feeling when we go to the field. Okay.
But in this, you're saying this men had leased land. Who works on that land? Is it migrant labor or who works?
It mostly them only, because especially in Trivandrum region, they only work in it because they cultivate high value vegetables like cowpea and that bitter gourd and other things.
Which what about family labor? Does family labor go into it?
In the case of
men cannot be doing all the work.
Yes. Family labor is there, but for the least.
No. Family labor means what do women do in that?
They water the plants, they tend the plants and other things.
Yeah, so that's a big thing.
Yeah. They do all the work, but the credit goes to the male farmer when it comes to the clustering and other things. Males will be coming and taking the decisions. They take all the money. So in the decision making process, the women are totally out. But all the work, all the dirty job in the farm, that are done by the women. So
Not
that
dirty,
kind of a
not dirty job, all the productive activities.
The strangest thing.
Activities, So the value of their work, because that's what we're talking about, these are sort of, they're seen as care work,
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
It's part of your family, contributing to your family, so it's not recognized as work as such.
Right.
So I think that debate you need to carry forward.
Yes.
You're doing that study.
Okay.
To carry, and then what is it that is different in Alleppey, in that Alappuzha area, where the movement also,
Yes. Women come together. They are in groups. They take up lands for lands in lease, maybe not even giving lease. They just go and ask the people, this land is left fallow, so shall we cultivate? So people think that, okay, let it become a bit clean. So you do the cultivation.
Area and all are much more conservative areas.
Yeah, that's true.
You know, see, all those things also you have to see in terms of why Alappuzha has its own history.
Yeah, that's true. That's true, madam. That's true. Some questions are there in the chat box. Have you seen that, or shall I read it for you?
I've seen the dowry one.
Okay.
Things that got married. Women studied well, doing their job, asking when to abolish. Law also needs to favor women. Yeah, yes, it's true. In Kerala, they're very strong about this marriage, getting married, and then, you know, the first question that's asked if somebody is doing an MA or something is your daughter married? When are you getting her married? You know, it's it's become a very predominant cultural thing to, you know, that is the end of that is what women and girls should aspire for, you know. And instead of studying well or getting a job, even if they're getting a job, then they're leaving it, marriage. I mean, these are really a big issue in Kerala. You know? I mean, that's you know, on the one hand, high education, on the other hand, these attitudes, patriarchal cultures. So I agree with you that no law, legally there are rights which are there. So, but it's not there in practice. Very strong. In fact, Kerala is moving more and more into stronger masculinities and patriarchies. And you will see it in the coming days. It's going to intensify, I can tell you. These debates will come up now in the coming days.
I think we can now wind up the session.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, it's a great honor. Actually, you talk a lot of things about the land. I wish it's almost 1.5 hours, I think you spent.
Yes, I'll some other time, you know, like I'd like to.
Yeah, we are very happy that, you know, you can speak a thing to the students.
Yes,
I'm present makes it convenient. That is also very good.
And also because I think in economics, you know, the students do a lot of field work. So they're able to sort of relate to this issue much more, you know, like, and sociology, for instance, you know, students are able to relate to these and much more.
Yeah.
Okay. So can we move on to the vote of thanks?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, sir. And now we are moving on to the vote of thanks. I would like to welcome Manu Pratap from Customary Economics to propose vote of thanks. Manu?
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. A very good afternoon to one and all present here. I, on behalf of Department of Economics, University of Kerala, and the entire fraternity of economists here together, extend a very hearty vote of thanks to all speakers for gracing your important work and sharing your findings with us. We are very grateful to have Professor Dr. V.P. Mahadevan Pillai, Hon'ble Vice Chancellor, University of Kerala, for inaugurating this conference and making it a special and auspicious one, and also promulgating and for unrolling blessings to this webinar conference with his words and presence. Thank you, sir. I must mention our deep sense of appreciation to Dr. Anitha V, Professor and Head of Department of Economics, University of Kerala, for addressing this session and also making this an extraordinary one. We would like to acknowledge our resource person, Dr. Mrs. Meera Velayudhan, Advisor, Gender Park and President, IAWS, for giving an excellent coverage on the topic.
President, my term just got over.
Madam?
No longer the president. I'm the term just got over.
Former president, yeah.
I'm
Just
in the executive committee, but I'm not the president.
Madam, on giving an excellent coverage on the topic women rights to land. We are all uncommonly inspired by your words and have gained a great awareness from your findings, ma'am. Finally, I would like to take this opportunity to place on record our hearty thanks to Sri Siddik Rabiyath, Assistant Professor, Department of Economics, University of Kerala, for perfect logistic support and guidance extended to all of us at this occasion. Thank you, sir. I cannot thank everyone enough for their involvement and making this a special and success one. We thank each and everyone for being with us throughout this session, and it's been a great pleasure. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Siddik.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Manu. Now this inaugural session is over. Our first technical session will begin at 2 p.m. The speaker is Anitha from United Nations University. We'll meet there. Thank you so much.